asking me to participate in this interesting interaction between artists and scholars and students and other practitioners. So I love the variety of people here. It has been a particular pleasure talking to some of you. My brief this morning, and when Arundhati and others asked me to speak here, I said, you know, I don't work on archives. I'm not a historian. I don't know what to say. I don't have, and of course, you know how persuasive and insistent they are. There's no getting away. So finally, we came to the conclusion that I would speak about the archival dimensions of my own work. That it is really a reflection on my own work, and what are the implications? What are the archival implications of it? You've already got a little biodata of the kind of archival work that has been done, but I would want to just add one note to it, which I obviously forgot to add when I composed that note. And that is, we worked on a book which was called Towards a Critical Medical Practice, which was, one part of it was a history of medicine, a history of medicine in the world, but also medicine in India. And in a sense, creating that history has some archival dimensions to it as well. So I will touch on that as well. Okay. Well, I must say that over yesterday's discussions, the idea of the archive that seemed to be dominant, there were other undercurrents, was the idea of a physical archive. Actually, materials that are put together, housed in a building or in a collection of some kind, or filed somewhere. And so the idea that there was a collection of materials and they would be filed and they would be accessible in one form or the other was in general the idea of the archive that was in transaction through yesterday's discussions. I thought this morning maybe it would be useful for us to recall or think about another dimension of the archive. And the fact that the archive is actually also a framework. It is a housing. It is the, what shall I say, I think Foucault calls it archaeology, others, Derrida talks about the frame. There are, the archive itself has those meanings that you have several archives, not just one archive. So here the idea of multiple archives, not necessarily as additive, but that each archive would bring with it a different frame, a different way of investigating and collecting documents that relate not so much to the past, and I'll come to that, as to the present. So then, how do you think about the archive as an imaginary structure? An imaginary structure that gives the materials in it, their actual significance or meaning. Okay. So if I look at my own work, where if I say we went back, going back to the mid-80s, the kind of new kind, no, maybe late 70s, all this work has, in actual fact, been addressing an imaginary archive that excluded somebody or the other. So there is a structure there. Maybe the structure of the very first book was a book of oral histories of women who participated in the 45-46 Telangana People's Movement. Right? These were women who were written out of history, but whose histories we tried to recover or to document and contribute to the mainstream history. It was that kind of framework in which we did it. And this was a critique of history writing itself, or the idea of history. It was also a critique of communism as it is practiced in India, and Marxist understanding of what constituted a movement. And each of these initiatives, which say collecting oral histories of women who battled alongside the men or in separate places in this movement, was a critique of the structure or the architecture of the existing way of recording that history. It's a critique. Okay? It is a contribution, but a contribution that does not get subsumed into the original, but transforms and breaks down the original in some way or the other. I wanted to say that it's strange, I'm using this word archive repeatedly here to describe my own work, but I think if I go back 35 or 40 years, or maybe even half a century, that the term archive would have never occurred to me as a term to use in relation to my work. So there's a new valency and a new currency to the term archive, which now draws into it a whole set of questions about how you create a lineage for something. You put together the materials that will create, another word that has sometimes been used, a genealogy, a lineage, a gathering of objects. Several different kinds of metaphors have been drawn on to think about this kind of thing. So then, how the stress then on the archive, the existing archive. So in my case, when we are looking at women writing in India, for instance, the archive is the canon. Those books that have been selected to represent what was English literature or any one of the Indian literatures, and therefore determined what was thought of as literature. Now that is an imaginary structure. It's not a physical structure. The problem is not the physical or material form of the texts that are included, but the ideas that find acceptance and the ideas that require to be pushed aside, or the writers that find acceptance and the writers who are left out who are. So the archive as a concept, and the archive, if you like, as a cultural arrangement of power, of exclusion, inclusion, hierarchization, assignment of meaning in different kinds of ways. So once you are thinking about the archive in that way as an imaginary structure, like we do speak very easily today of the nation as an imagined concept. So here the archive as an institution of the imaginary, then you are opening out, you're able to open out the archive or to critique it or to pull it apart, pull the strands apart in different kinds of ways. So what does it mean then to say, look at women's writing? It requires that we extricate a text from a housing to which it has been relegated. This is not good. Okay. This is not good because it is autobiography, it is not biography, it's not of public importance, it's just a book. So it's not enough to find the text, you have to find the structure that is imposed on this text in order to exclude it. You have to find a way of thinking about how you extricate that text from the prison into which it has been sent off, and then how you rearrange the mainstream or the body to which you are addressing in order for this text to find value and meaning in that mainstream composition. So that process requires both a conceptualization of the mainstream and a conceptualization of the institutions that exclude or house excluded material, and then the construction of a passage that allows you to move from this exclusion into some kind of broadened or widened sense of the mainstream. Okay, that's a transaction that takes place. Now, when you're thinking about this imaginary nature or the cultural nature or the alignments of the archive with power, all these three sort of line up one against the other, you have to constantly pull against the idea of the archive as a kind of realist machine. Real objects that are placed there, that are organized according, in some kind of empirical mythology, organized according to their own natural formation. Okay? And each of these realist aspects of the realist machine that would ground and limit the archive needs to be separately attended to and opened up. And each of these, then what does it mean? Each of these strands is like a complex weave, if you like. If you pull out each of the strands, each of them give you a new way into the archive and a new way of thinking about how excluded objects or excluded phenomena would make their way back, but also transform the mainstream. It's a two-way process. But one of the interesting things about inviting someone into your house is that your house is totally transformed by that invitation. You can't keep it the same as it was before. Okay? And this is also true about new texts or new objects that you want to bring into the archive. Without the archive changing itself, it can't just say, here is a new cupboard into which you can put this object. Everything has to be rearranged. And the relationship between the different cupboards in which you place things has also to be rethought. Okay? So, cupboards are a metaphor that is used by many artists now, are thinking about filing cabinets, the cabinet, the cupboard, and the arrangement of objects in it as a way of rethinking the order of things. Remember? The order of things. So we're talking about kind of transition between frameworks. But when you think of two frameworks in some kind of dialogue with each other, the one that excludes and the one that is potentially the place where the inclusion should take place, that dialogue always is a dialogue in language. It's not a dialogue in midair, It's not like something you buy from the market. You can't even buy just an object from the market. What you buy from the market is already a spoken for object, an object that comes along with its trappings. And that spoken for object must come into another place which is speaking in a different way. So there's a dialogue involved in that movement. And the logic of dialogue is not the logic of simple transfer. You cannot pull into an existing archive or an existing archival imagination an object that was formerly displaced from it or excluded from it without in some way looking to how you will restitch that object in what is the embroidery you will use to restitch that pattern into this larger pattern. How do you make it? Or is that the larger pattern and this the smaller one? Does what is regarded as exclusion, is that the primary metaphor of the archive? Is what is included very, very limited? So we do know in terms of the discussion of the canon of English literature, for instance, or the canon of any major literature, that what was included was very minor, okay? That it actually represented maybe 5% of the population of any country. Was the important, what were considered the important works, were the the works of a very minor and defined group within a field. So the question of how you look at what was called minor, and is what was called minor the source from which transformation takes place, is a question that comes up when we're so then, another word that often comes up today, and which when I was doing my own work I never used, you know, there's some words that are thrust upon you, and archive is a word that was thrust upon me. And I thought, oh, archive, you know, I've never really thought about my work as archival, but of course once you start thinking about it, you realize how importantly archival it is. So, along with the word archive, there was another word, and I can see two protagonists in this audience who were very important in pushing these concepts on me, was the word curation. Now, if you are battling invisible or assumed structure, then in order to bring in another object into that structure or cause that structure to travel in some way, then these concepts need to be discussed. Okay. You need to, you cannot just pick up this object and bring it in and place it in a cupboard. You have to look at the structure of the cupboard, you have to push other objects around, you have to then place this object in that cupboard but transform the cupboard in some way. So the idea of curation brings in the notion that there is a conceptual housing, a critical conceptual housing with which you need to look at objects or the materials of an archive always. And it drew attention to this. So if you look at the women's movement and the questions it raised as far as the arts were concerned or as far as literature was concerned, it is a whole series of conceptual proposals that say this is how you have to curate women's writings, that is, how do you understand everything that frames a writer, Mudupalani, whose text was considered erotic and therefore poor literature, it's dismissed, it's censored, it becomes becomes banned, and so on. So there are these gradations through which you can exclude, or sometimes you can just forget, or you can decry something. You can say this is no good. This has a morality attached to it that would disturb or undermine mainstream society and so on. So there are many ways in which this pushing out can happen, and some ways are more historically significant than others, that you are looking at those frameworks. I've just written here, censored, dismissed, trivialized, subjugated, forgotten. So the forgotten can sometimes also pop up in unusual places, and my favorite example of this is a poem written by a nun, a very beautiful and very well structured poem that she wrote as she was leaving her home and entering the nunnery. And there was it's like the Nigerian Mona Lisa, there was a memory of this poem in the gossip that surrounded Malayalam literature, but nobody could find a copy. And finally, I was talking about this to somebody who was doing some other translation for me, and he said, oh yes, there is a copy and I know where it is. It's a handwritten copy in my mother's Bible. So this one copy is preserved in a different kind of archive, if I may use that term for it, and it comes in with all its value around it, the value of this woman who writes it out and then keeps it in the most valuable book that is there for her in her life, and what this poem resurfaces in this new housing. Now, how do you bring this housing, You bring the poem into the collection, but you also have to bring that housing into the collection. Otherwise the poem is not interesting. It doesn't have that charge to it. So it involves a lot of what a very important thinker called outwork. That where if the canon and the archive is taken for granted, it's realist, it's there, it's an existing institution, it's a machine that can produce, then the outwork becomes irrelevant. You don't need it, everybody knows it, it's there in common life. But if it is a new object, that object must come with substantial support material that allows that object to travel into regular discourse or the mainstream. Now, that exterior, there are many images for it. Derrida talks about it as the parerga, the white space inside the frame. Others have spoken about it as institutions. What is the institution that houses a document or an event and so on? Or you can talk about it as a culture, the more simple and everyday way in which we can think about it. Cultures that exclude, and how you have to discuss the culture that excludes in order to understand how the process of inclusion can take place or not take place, or why it doesn't take place, and so on. Now, of course, I still remember how many writers, especially, and great critics of literature, said to me, Susie, you have some really wonderful texts in this book, but it's too much critical material. Okay? There's too much discussion. Now the thing is, without that discussion, those texts would have gone right back where they came from. That you need the discussion, you need that curatorial intervention and arrangement and argument with the mainstream in order to make these new archives viable. It's not that they take on the canonical position, but they have a new kind of viability in the discussion. So then, what is the implication of all this? Well, one thing that is very important for us to understand, I feel, and we often forget, is the archive has nothing to do with the past. It has only a past effect. It comes looking as though it is an old object, it's frayed and it's whatever. But it is fully invested with meanings from the present. It is an object that acquires meaning only in the present, and it's a present day discussion, battle, desire, aspiration, what have you, that energizes and brings life to, and enlivens the object. And that present day discussion has to be there in order to frame it in any archive. If it is just in a list, it's not going to work. Now, those who are used to taking their hold over the archive for granted are impatient with the new discussion. It's too much. We know already what this object is. And we don't need so many trappings. Very often it was mainstream writers who were the most impatient with the discussion that surrounded this work. And of course, you know that people from students, people who always felt that they had some kind of complaint against the canon or were uncomfortable, welcomed enormously the outwork. In fact, some people were more interested in the outwork, which in some senses is a valid reaction to have than in the artwork itself, in the literary text itself. Now, why is the artwork interesting? The artwork is interesting because these excluded texts actually allow you to discuss the current moment in which the transaction is taking place or the activity is taking place. So one of those funny things about history, you think what could be more about the past than history? That history is all about the present. Okay. It is about the present battles for the past or the present initiatives to find a past that will endorse or enable an action in the present. History is everything to do with the present. And I think from where modern history, it has been a way always of working with and giving a past to contemporary power structures. Okay. And that function for history may be, I don't know, it could go back much earlier, because even the chronicles were ways of kings establishing their authority through a story of their reign or their power or whatever it is. So the tying in of the idea of the past, the archive, the documents of the past, the idea of the past, the frameworks in which the past is held, I think one of the things that the new work has enabled is an understanding that this is not a debate that is about deep time, but it is debate about the battles in the contemporary moment. Okay? So in our world today, history is enormously at issue. Okay? And I think sometimes we less than understand the situation when we say, this is true history. And what you are suggesting is untrue history. It's not backed by fact. Okay? Now all these are very, very fraught questions. The battle is between two versions of history, two proposals about history. And those proposals about history are proposals about the present. They're proposals that come from the present, but they are proposals that have to do with the future. They're not proposals about the past. It is a past that is being redeployed for embattled and contested futures. There's a contesting in it. So the archive, in a strange kind of way, is about the future. It's about where we're going and where we could go and where we went wrong in the past, if you like, all right? Or where the past was frozen in a way that does not enable a movement into the future. So even big, I think this is commonly accepted now, so if a big museum would say we have these holdings, okay, but we will do 15 exhibitions every year that deal with new topics and search through our holdings and rearrange them in different ways. Okay? And then present you with some discussion about what these holdings could be. Unfortunately, we're not yet really taking seriously enough the battles about the past that we should be engaging in the present. We're still saying, this is true, this is untrue. This is good, this is not good. But we are not yet, and by we, I mean secular, modern. You and me, I presume this is more or less the people in this audience. We are not yet willing to acknowledge and concede that when a Dalit person is saying, this past was a past which is misrepresenting the lives of whatever, and therefore a past that I have a quarrel with. We're not seeing that as a battle about the present. We're saying, mostly we're saying, oh, that is a past injury. Okay? It's not a past injury. It is a present day injury for which a lineage is being found, and so on. And similarly, the battles with the right wing, where history has become extremely important. I think one way of looking at it is to say, this is not factual. There are facts. Okay? But facts, as you know, like the foundations of the Ram temple, facts can be found. You know, of course, that the foundations of the Ram temple have been found. Okay? The archaeologists have dug and they found these foundations. Now, what does that fact mean? Outside the debate today about what India is, who is Indian, how we want this society to be and what our aspirations are, what sort of power we require, those historical questions are irresolvable. There's no way we can address them. So that is really the crux of my argument. The current charge, the contemporary charge of the past. So archives will always be rearranged, redistributed according to the questions that come up. New archives will be found, some others will be left aside. And some archives will be very temporary. They fulfill a purpose and then you don't need them. Not everything will be housed as the national, when the nation wants to possess the past completely, it builds a big building and it makes many filing cabinets and it orders everything alphabetically. That alphabetical ordering is the biggest sort of victory of nationalism. You put everything in a kind of a system which can be is equal and can be easily retrieved and so on. It's true. I mean, the French discovered alphabetical ordering. Diderot is the first one to propose it when he wanted to make an encyclopedia, a national encyclopedia of all the knowledges in the world, and you ordered it alphabetically, apparently for retrieval, but alphabetical ordering is a strange equalizer as well. Everything is the same in alphabetical order. So the nation makes this big monumental archive, and the effort today is largely to demonumentalize that archive, to recover the archive as document, as something with which you read or something that you read, all right? Not something that buttresses an existing formation like nationalism. So let me look at some of the books that I've had the pleasure and the opportunity of working on. One of the very earliest, going back to the late 1970s, as I said, was a book of oral histories. Now, oral history itself, history assumes that it is written. Anything that is spoken is subjective. But as soon as speech turns into writing, it gets the guarantee of objectivity. It somehow magically becomes something that is potentially objective. Now, that how is this sleight of hand carried out? That as soon as it is written, it is objective, or it has the potential of being objective. If it is spoken, it is subjective. I mean, I'm speaking now. I hope I'm not completely subjective in what I'm saying, but it is also subjective. So the idea that you could recover history from speaking to people whose subjective experiences were the basis for an objective understanding of the reality of that time. Okay? Now, a lot of battles had to be fought, partly because what were the women doing? They were mostly at home, actually. They didn't really go out to fight on the battlefront. And even if they were fighting on the battlefront, the men were shooting the guns and the women were just handing them the bullets. Now, this is a very interesting division of labor, where one part of the labor is significant and the other part of the labor is not so. Okay? Or the women, etc., etc. I mean, these are very familiar arguments to most of you because you are all of you well-schooled in the arguments of feminism, so it would not be surprising for you that this kind of marginalization took place. But there were other questions that were simply not addressed at all. The fact that in village meetings that the Communist Party organized, the men would sit separately from the women, and 1/3 of the place was reserved for men, and 2/3 of the place was reserved for women. That at the village level, the women were far more enthusiastic about the movement than the men were. And perhaps for good reasons. They would suffer both as workers and as women. There would be a double kind of resentment against the power that was required to be overthrown. And they would have a wider range of issues that they wanted to discuss. But these, of course, never went beyond the 1/3 and the 2/3, because by the time you came to the podium, and by the time the podium went to the local committee, and the local committee went to the central committee, these facts had been erased. Another very interesting question that comes up is the question of children. Now, if you're underground and you are moving from place to place, if you have a child, what do you do with it? Now, I hope this is not true, what I'm going to say now, but I fear it is true, that it is far easier for the father to say, we leave the child with my parents, and then we can still continue underground. But it's a very hard thing for a mother to say. One, for physiological reasons. You are bound to this child in ways that requires the nourishment and the rearing of that child. And the other, for emotional and what else? Cultural reasons. That these emotions are culturally formed. Maybe the man should be as much attached to the child or to this baby as the woman would be, but that's not how it works out. That's maybe in another generation or in another yuga or something like that. It depends on how you want to think of time, but not now. So this was a question, the question of children was one that constantly troubled them. And yet we have a revolutionary group that simply does not address this dimension of what it means to have a political strategy that cannot address one very basic aspect of human life, of reproduction. And so on. There are many, many very interesting questions that come up through these texts. But there are also questions that enrage the Communist Party, literally enrage the Communist Party. And we were very surprised, because these were our comrades. And these were people who we trusted and who we considered among the best human beings we knew. I mean, these were not people who were exploitative and unfeeling. And these were, yeah, I can say that quite openly. These were the best human beings we knew. And yet they were enraged by these kinds of, what they said were unfair criticisms. Now, if you take the rage and the idea of an unfair criticism, you get a feel of the frameworks that have to be transferred, brought up, discussed, traveled across, as it were. Any fact, and even an entity, a discipline, a practice, is always nested in some sort of archive. And that fact has to be prized loose. When we engage with it anew, we have to prize it loose from that archive. That is a conscious and critical process before it is taken, travels into a new archive. And I'm afraid very often all these processes are shortcut. There are shortcuts taken through them. You just pick the fact as though it is a fact, and it moves. You pick a broom as though it's a broom. You were discussing that yesterday, and you were saying, no, it's not just a broom. It's the person who uses the broom, the person who made the broom, and so on. It's the broom itself and what it stands for. It's so many things. So how do you take it? It's a whole set of archives in which that broom exists, and then you move it into a. Okay. Now the broom is a complex object. It's a very complex object. And the movement of the broom into a modern day museum or an archive is something that requires that kind of complex analytical thinking to be and discussion and political work and you name it. So it's a process. A very interesting, and I'm shifting gears a little bit, a very, very interesting notion of the archive comes up in this work that we did on modern medicine, on a critique of modern medical practice, which was an initiative we took in order to try and create a course in the humanities for medical students. So it was very practical kind of work. So what do we discover, and I'm entirely indebted to Foucault's work for this particular set of insights. Commonly we tend to think of modern medicine as completely focused on healing the individual and not focused enough on society, on public health, on garbage, Swatch initiatives of various kinds and so on. But if we look historically, we find that modern medicine, the sort of cradle of modern medicine is social medicine. Governments wanting to create populations that were strong, ensure that babies that were born were well nutrited, ensure that there would be armies in the future to fight the battles that were required, that there would be a labor force that would, and this goes back to about in Europe to about the 16th or 17th century. So what we're saying here is that we have today an individual medical practice that looks as though it has to do with the individual's body, and which is entirely separate from the social body, but it is a formation, its archival formation, its deep past, is the formation of a social medicine. Okay? Now, if we look at contemporary medicine, you see traces of this very clearly. Many of us have been diagnosed as carrying a risk of some kind. Okay? We don't have a disease, but there is a risk of something or the other, of arthritis or think of some young diseases for me, please. And so on, okay? So now the idea that a risk is treatable and that you can buy a medicine for it and that a doctor can prescribe something is an idea that comes out of the governmental or social formation of medicine. It's, a risk is not a disease. If you have a risk, you're not ill. Okay? It is a potential that an overseeing body of medical body or a governmental body, or is there, if there is a risk of let's say dengue or of diarrhea or of diabetes that is there, then the government has to pay attention to this. But more than that, the very structure of the disease, which we embrace so intimately as our own and worry about it and think about it as a factor of, the structure of that is a structure of social medicine. Now I don't have the time to go into that fascinating argument. If you're interested in it, there are 3 or 4 lectures that Foucault gave in Brazil in the mid-70s that lays out this, and there is the book that we have put together that extends this argument and develops it in relation to this. So what does the archive of medicine tell us about medical practice today? How do you trace that archive? Now, the archive of medicine is not just what we can find out about Kala-Azar or about leprosy or about tuberculosis, or those big diseases that were historically important diseases. It is the framework or the entire housing that situates that disease. And that brings me to the last most important piece of work that I have been involved in, and that is the work on Dalit writing. Now this is an entirely different kind of archive because it's not about the past. There's very little in those 2 books. There's a long history to Dalit writing, and you can pick it up, and there is a way in which you might say that all Indian art is Dalit art. That the history of Indian art should be called the history of Dalit art, because painters, performers, musicians, craftspeople, you name it. That this was the group of people that practiced these forms and actually maintained the knowledge and passed down the knowledge, educated others in these forms, and also made them viable as marketable, useful to society, and so on. Okay? So in a very simple way, it's a bit like, you know, that the barbers were the surgeons until the 19th century, and then after the 19th century, the caste of surgeons shifts, and you can fill in for yourself what the caste of surgeons become after the 19th century. You know, there's a total shift that takes place. So similarly with art, music, performance, traditions, and so on. So there's at one level, there's a huge area that simply has not been entered or argued or intelligently archived, if you like, that relates to Dalit art. But we were looking at modern Dalit literature, contemporary Dalit literature. And the framework we wanted to use for it is one of saying, what are the materials with which one could think about the Dalit issue today? How do these writings that come from different locations, but all written by people who are subjectively also experiencing this phenomena, how do these materials help us understand the question? Now, we could have written an essay on it, I suppose. I couldn't. I know I couldn't. But it was so important then to have an archival format for it, to say that this is a collection, an anthology, if you like, or, you know, but an anthology that has some historical span. And it's an anthology then that helps us in a contemporary moment grapple with the many dimensions and debates and cross currents that grow through this issue. So sometimes people ask me, they say, what can we read in order to understand caste? And my knees buckle under me. It's that, or they very quickly will have some answer for, oh yes, there is a caste problem, we need to do something about it. That it is such a problem that's so complexly stitched into the rest of society that it requires, we need to do maybe 5-6 years of careful reading and study and discussion and witnessing experience, various kinds of things, in order to get a grasp of what the contemporary format of that issue is. Caste is not some frozen thing, all right? Or the Dalit question is not like something there that you can get hold of and that you can address. It is in circulation and it is constantly interacting with other things, and we have to look at it in those frames. So how do you create the frameworks with which to look at it? These are some of the challenges that we minimally address in those collections, and we do have these two collections of contemporary Dalit writings, each of which is framed by a very simple biography of the writer, which is itself a rich document of caste life in the last 2 or 3 decades. I always hope that there will be some non-Dalit people who give those books a patient reading. I haven't found many. Okay, non-Dalits are in a hurry to learn about the caste question and to grasp it. Okay? Dalits have spent a lifetime thinking about it. They're not in a hurry and they largely enjoy the books. And I always think that those books are a sort of last gift of mine to my Dalit students. And that would be the shape of that archive as far as I am concerned, personally. But there would be many other shapes also to the archive. So let me just pull what I've been saying together. That we need, and I've been emphasizing the need to think about the conceptual formation, conceptual dimensions of the archive, not just the practical, the storage formations, if you like, the realist notion of the archive. What are the structures of the archive? And that's when the archive becomes a live political issue. And secondly, the archive is a contemporary issue. It's not about the past. It is about battles that are being fought in the contemporary moment. I've taken too much time.
Regarding the last part of your lecture, I wanted to know what are the criteria of inclusion or exclusion when you are making this Dalit writing, Dalit literature? That was my question.
I would say they're mixed criteria. It's not like a canon which has a criticism attached to it, and that there were many different reasons why, and we've called it a dossier. It's not canonical, it's not an anthology, it's a dossier, and a dossier is an open text into which you can insert other things, take out some things, rethink the organization. Okay. So it's that, and a dossier is also a working document, something that you use in order to work with. So what were the criteria? The criteria is sometimes quite trivial and banal. It was people we were told about when we were traveling through Tamil Nadu or through, it was people some of us had read or friends had read and had told us. So, but there is always also, if you go to any region or any language, there is a general understanding about who would be the important writers in this period or in the small period that we were looking at. And there would always be some reasons why some other people could also have been included or not included. And I would say that is very true. It's very true. And so if it's a dossier, then it's asking an open-ended it's making an open-ended kind of proposal. So what was the criteria? The criteria is those people we had learnt about, those we had read and found significant. It's very, very thin criteria.
What I wanted to understand was how do you develop Dalit as a conceptual category? Why you are doing this?
It's cumulative, you know. It's not a known and fixed category. Even today, if you said define Dalit or define a woman, let's say woman, you can understand it better when you define woman. You can't in one sense, and yet you can. Female gender, you look in the dictionary, you will find a very clear definition of what woman is. So there is, if you like, that kind of, what should I say, engaged and yet not closed off space, that criteria. So very simply, things we had heard about, things we had read, things we had discussed about, people, so new suggestions would come, other reasons why we couldn't find some text, so then you cannot include some, you can't just put a gap in gap page, maybe you could have put a gap page and so on. So there isn't any hard and fast criteria, and it is our personal, finally it is our personal decisions about what to include, what not to include. And they're open, they're in
Thank you for this lecture. You speak for many of us. That's what I can say. I had a query about the history of medicine, which I've been trying to look up myself for other reasons. What I've been struck by is the relatively recent emergence of medicine as a science. At the time when physics is very advanced, medical sciences are still emerging. I mean, if you look at the history of medicine right up to the end of the 19th century, it's still, you know, relatively, I mean, quite, you know, still there are very few things available. The real period of growth is, you know, 20th century, the mid-20th century. That's not my point. The point is that when thinking about medicine, have you tried or ever thought about the kind of rhetoric that medicine, unlike the other sciences, incorporates, in the sense that it must always be true now, displacing all other truths? And this truth is something which cannot be questioned. It generates or seeks to generate the discourse of medicine. This, perhaps it's for our good that we believe in doctors and do the things the doctors say, but it constantly displaces earlier ideas and creates something which is true now and true in a complete or undeniable sense.
Well, the framework of science is generally ahistorical in that sense. It will have a history which is an account, but the framework is of today and modern, and its temporal dimensions are, there's no deep time in the framework of science. So the history of science is just a narrative or a story. It's not a conceptual history of the concepts of science and the formation of science. But I think today there is much more consciousness that there are many different ways of imaging the body or of analyzing the body, and there are pop ways of doing it, so each one of us knows what we should eat or should not eat, or eat garlic or don't eat something else. So every day there would be some new whatever. But there are also much more serious acknowledgement of different systems. The Chinese system of medicine, Ayurveda, much more so that even Western medicine, I feel today Western medicine, unlike you, that Western medicine is very conscious of its limitations and is very quick to suggest that you can go and do this, or you might try this, or you whatever, when it comes up against cause itself. But its self-definition is imperial in the way that you are discussing it. Maybe so it's like, I'm the greatest, but yes, it's possible that there are other whatevers as well. And where does that come from? So if you want to say what composes that, I think it has to do with the absolute alignment of medical power with governmental power.
Thanks, Susie. Very rich, lots to think about. My question would be, how do you negotiate orality when you're trying to put together, let's say, this collection, this dossier, let's say, Dalit writing or women's writing? How do you just, is the criterion at some level the written text, or would you then consider as a researcher going through the process of recording an oral narrative and then, well, creating a written text? Now, I bring this up because when I was working in Rajasthan, women's songs, and I would look upon a song as a text here, with a lot of complexities. That song is never fixed, you know, and there are a lot of enigmas around how women sing collectively. So if you record one song and you record it 10 minutes later, whatever, it will not be, the order of the lines will be completely different, for example. And so I was just wondering, how do you handle these enigmas, you know, of actual performance, if you will, you know, and what happens to those enigmas when you, in a sense, when you write, unfortunately, you've got to fix the words and punctuation and things like that. So I'd love to hear from you on this.
Well, you know, in Women Writing India, we tried to bring in women's songs. They were so rich and beautiful, and it seemed like a travesty to leave them out. And unfortunately, the framework under which we brought them in was the framework of the folk, which today I understand and realize is a completely, what shall I say, patronizing kind of framework in which to look at it. And in this new book, we haven't used, now there are other books that deal with Dalit writing, and they have used the oral material. And they have in a very straightforward manner, written down what was, and given it punctuation, and then written something about the author and so on. But Satya and I felt that this was a very, very complex task, and that it would need entirely separate attention. And there was no reason, there was good reason why political songs could be included, which also vary like this. They change according to where it's sung, what has happened yesterday, who is singing it, and so on. Should have been included, but the complexity overwhelmed us. So some of things are just a cop-out. You know, we can't do this right now. We're not ready to do it. We don't know how to do it. Which also gives an anthology like this less authoritative positioning, you know? And it's something that I like, because I think in art, the canonical, the great art, or whatever, has always had this very authoritative tone and formation attached to it. And that it's good to have something that leaves you puzzled and that you're not able to leave it. And yes, there are many cop-outs in that. And the richness of that experience for me is thinking about why we had to cop out.
I want to bring you back to what you were speaking about, the Dalit, what shall I say, history. You also put it so very well and so strongly that it's a present pain, it's a present wound, and it's a lineage that's being traced. And I want to add to what was asked with inclusion, exclusion. With today, you have Dalit voices that are very clear and very strongly demanding that the upper caste please stop speaking for them, and they can speak for themselves very well. And it's a perfectly, you know, and there's all of this discomfort obviously among the upper caste about the stridency of this sort of position. But why must they even be reasonable? The history of what is, you know, what they've undergone, there's nothing reasonable about it. I just wanted to know what you might say about this, or what you feel this idea of who speaks for whom, or do you only speak what you know, and those things, because then so much is excluded. And I know it's a very large question, but
it's a very, very large question. But let me start by saying that I'm a child of the women's movement, and one of the things that the women's movement said is we don't want the men to speak for us. Okay? That we want to organize separately. We want to speak for ourselves. We want space to think for ourselves. We don't want expert voices telling us what is what or what. So this push of what you might think of as the organic voice, that which has experienced and thought about based on that experience, and is using that both critically and in an expressionist way, is very, very important. But I would say that unlike the women's movement, we were very hostile to having men come in. So I remember, for instance, when we had our meetings and we would go back home, our husbands would be waiting to hear what had happened, and they were our comrades and they were doing things with us and so on, waiting to hear what had happened in the meetings, and we would maintain a stony silence. These are questions that have a history. Why did we do that? It was important for us to preserve that space, okay? And that it's important for other movements to do it. It has been important for other movements to do it. But the Dalit movement, unlike the women's movement, it's very angry about people speaking for them. But it is much more open to collaboration, is what I found. it's not, it's, so for various other kinds of, I don't know what the reasons are, but it's not, it's not closed in the way the women's movement was. Today the women's movement is not closed, we are confident enough to be open, but at that formative stage we were saying no, alright, you may be the greatest of men, but no. And I find the story somewhat different. You see many more collaborations, many more discussions. But I think there is a demand for humility in that collaboration, that you are in a learning position. Does that